Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's Sunday, it's the 11th of June. Today I'm joined by a very interesting guest who's got a lot of experience on South Africa and electricity. It's Dave Nicholls. He's the chairperson of NEXA, the nuclear energy, was it NEXA, nuclear energy body of South Africa,
Corporation. Corporation.
Corporation of South Africa. There we go. And
Yeah.
he was also a chief nuclear officer at Eskom, so he had a whole career in Eskom, so he knows the whole history of the story and the electricity story. So yeah, Dave, welcome again back to this channel.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Hope I can add
So,
some interest.
well, I put the title as "Understanding the Cost of Nuclear," and I sort of want to start there because everyone has been saying that nuclear in South Africa is expensive, nuclear in the world is expensive. Can you maybe give us, I think, first just a brief overview of what is the nuclear industry in South Africa, and then from there we sort of move into new plants and costs and things of that sort.
Okay, South Africa is very simple. We used to have a very big nuclear program. In fact, the AEC, the precursor to NEXA, was at one point the only site on Earth where, for example, yellow cake came in and titanium ore came in and fuel assemblies came out. You know, the whole thing, everything was on one site. But getting where we are now, and so South Africa started the nuclear industry back in the 1940s. In fact, we were one of the uranium suppliers to the Manhattan Project. And by the 1960s, they were building Safari, which is our research reactor, at Pelindaba, just northwest of Pretoria. And that was also the base of where NEXA, which is the nuclear national lab, essentially, we run that facility. And it's running very well, by the way. Just a quick sales pitch. Safari is running, we think, the highest availability of any research reactor in the world, about 300 days a year on load. And our biggest single commercial activity is radioisotopes. About 20% of the world's radioisotopes. If someone's injecting, anywhere in the world, if someone's injecting a radioisotope into you, there's about 1 in 5 chance it came out of Pelindaba. And so we're good playing that. That's NEXA. And then Eskom, the state power company, built a twin unit nuclear plant in Cape Town called Koeberg. It's 2 by 1,000 megawatts, 3 loop. It's a French built plant. It's to the Westinghouse design. Its real reference unit is North Anna. North Anna was a reference for Tristan in France, and our plant is essentially a reference of Tristan. So it's very much a Westinghouse 3 loop plant built by Framatome. Started construction, ordered in 76, planned for in service in 82, was sabotaged just for fuel load. A few limpet mines, 1 in each vessel head, and one each on the long cable trays. They were quite clever attack, and so about an 18-month delay while that was fixed. The machine went on load in 84, 85. The 2 machines came on load. Now coming to 40 years of life, so they've run very well. We're now changing the steam generators on both the machines, and I can do a long discussion of the fact that we've managed to run steam generators for 40 years with of old style Inconel 600 millennials, and both units are still running well inside all their limits. So we could have gone a few more years, but we're changing the SGs for 690 SGs at the moment, and with an aim to get the plant to 60 years of life, from maybe longer than that. There has been talk in South Africa of building more nuclear plants. I just explain geography quickly. South Africa's a big place. Koeberg is in the Western Cape, near Cape Town, about 30 kilometers north of Cape Town, and it is 1,500 kilometers from the next power station. The next baseload power station is called Letabo, and it's up just south of Johannesburg, which is literally 1,400 kilometers away, which makes electrical power supplies quite important, because clearly you've got and the South Africa's a very, very integrated grid, and it pumps power around the grid quite nicely. So we move power over 1,000 kilometers without very much worry. So there's talk of new build plants. There is a big debate in the country, I'd argue, at the moment, between those who believe, if you believe in net zero by 2050, you better build nuclear power stations, because we've got no hydro potential in the country, or no serious hydro potential.
Yeah.
And renewables and batteries don't hack it. So if you're going to go for net zero by 2050, you better start getting your nuclear ducks in a row. This debate's been going on in different forms literally for the last 20 years of building a nuclear plant. We got very close to it in 2008 when the world energy crisis, when the world financial crisis put a hold on things, and the government now has a 2,500 megawatt provision in the current energy plan for more nuclear plant to be built as a precursor, presumably to more than that being built in the future. As we stand, Coburg's had no major, our nuclear power plant at Coburg has had no significant events in its life. Had a few trips and things. It won for a couple of years. We were running at over 93% availability. In fact, we were the best country in the world in terms of availability for, I think, 2016, 2017. I have to be careful. There were the years I was chief nuclear officer, so I'm not being too biased. The moment we're just changing, we're doing midlife work, and it's really knocked the living daylights out of the availability of the 2 units at the moment, because we had a long shutdown because of COVID. That was driven in part because you've got to bring, because Coburg, we don't have some of the highly specialized skills we bring in from overseas to do work, because we only have 2 units. So the outage support is easy to bring in from overseas. And of course, in the middle of COVID, you couldn't do that. So we had a couple of outages that were very affected by the fact you couldn't get people into the country because COVID restrictions stopped it. But essentially, well-maintained, well-run station, reasonably run, well updated, a lot of modifications to it in terms of safety. Yeah, that's about it in the country.
Okay,
I can go on for 3 hours if we can talk about it.
No, that's quite a comprehensive interview. So far, you've got Coburg, you've got a few things, and we have got at Valputs the waste disposal facility as well. Or?
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's interesting is that the Valputs Nuclear Waste Repository, which is a repository for disposal of intermediate low-level waste, was commissioned before the end of Coburg's first fuel cycle. So we've been disposing of our low-level intermediate level waste since 84, 85. Shipped up there for disposal. It's a shallow burial. It is on the edge of the Karoo. It is about 100 square kilometers of land is owned as part of the facility, of which about 1% is used. About 1 square kilometer is actually being used at the moment. So it's essentially almost unlimited space. There have been test drillings there to see boreholes to see what the ground underneath is like, and it looks quite suitable for deep disposal. But the current view is that Coburg has just started moving fuel assemblies out of the spent fuel pool into casks. That really started a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And there is a plan to put a centralized interim storage facility for the overall nuclear program at Valputs. And the reason that's being thought about is because there were significant corrosion problems at Coburg. Coburg is one of the most corrosive sites literally on Earth. You know, it is unbelievable yet. When I first joined Coburg in 84, we hadn't even commissioned the second unit, and we were replacing the ventilation machinery because it had corroded away. It ceased to exist. Some of the plant because it was so corrosive down there. We'd used gravelene as our reference for the corrosion, and we've changed our reactor water storage tanks because they corroded. That's not happening anywhere else in the world as far as so there was a point that we would move the casks up to Valputs for storage, not for final disposal. That would come a later decision. But clearly, the corrosion problems in Valputs are essentially zero. The water table water hasn't moved over 10,000 years. There is no rain up there. There is no.
Yeah, I mean,
there's no economic value. No economic value. We have in about 20 kilometers, about 20 people live. It really is, a very empty part of the world.
It's literally the ideal place to dispose anything for that matter, because it's in the middle of the desert, basically.
Well, many years ago, there was a suggestion that we should put an interim store there for the whole world. So the Pangaea project looked a lot at that as one of the sites, like Australia. And the Pangaea project was one that was going to look at putting a centralized store for the world. And you would have been able to stack up, the world's waste on that site without any problems and with vast amounts of money. But clearly, politics means that shipping nuclear waste around is challenging.
Yeah, but isn't nuclear waste, correct me if I'm wrong here, doesn't it run on a negative interest rate? I mean, it's one of the few problems that makes sense to kick down the can, right?
Well, that's the interesting problem about it. Everyone says, why have we not disposed of nuclear waste? I have this discussion always. It's kind of like a discussion about costing. I'll just take 2 costs to begin, and I'll come back to the main costing bit. Nuclear waste and decommissioning is always quoted as being not fully accounted for. But if you do any accounting of decommissioning at about 15% of the capital cost of the plant, so I think taking a real number nowadays, then you can work out that 15% of the capital cost spent 60 years after you start up. If you discount it at any kind of discount rate of any sense, it disappears off the calculations. It's almost trivial. The problem with spent fuel is that you put the money away, and like Coburg has done, they were allocating money for disposal of spent fuel. So you now put the spent fuel in a cask. This cask just sits there. It weighs about 200 tons. You want to, and people say, well, what happens if someone steals it? My answer is, well, you may notice it going out the door if someone steals that kind of thing. And it sits there. And every year, your cost of maintaining it is essentially zero. Your cost of disposal is actually going down. And it's going down because your radioactive waste is decaying, and your decay heat, that is the energy generated by the decay of the fission products, is what drives the spacing and the size of the underground facility.
Yeah.
So if you've got less decay heat, you can pack them together closer, so it's cheaper to dispose of. But every year your decommissioning fund gets worth more because you're investing it in like the US decommissioning funds on their coal station, on the nuclear stations. It's getting worth more. So every year your cost of every year the argument of should I decommission this year or next year, the answer is always next year. And the only argument for final disposal is really if you believe you've got to replace the casks. And the US NRC, I think, has recently think the casks may last 200 years. So it's, yes, when you try and solve the model of when you dispose of the fuel, the answer comes back never. You just sit there and watch this cask, and you buy your Sunday papers.
That's because of the half-life. I mean, half-life's exponential, so the interest rate is negative.
So you kind of watch it, and the longer you leave it, the less hassle it is.
So it'll be a good business model to buy nuclear waste. Assuming you can ever get it tradable.
Oh yes. I don't know. I've no illusion. It's like in the US now, where you've got companies like, I'm thinking of name in a second. I can't forget his name. One of the companies is now buying old nuclear reactors as a decommission with their decommissioning fund on the basis they can do it cheaper than the decommissioning fund. And the other problem you've got is the assumption you're going to do decommissioning immediately, and there's no logic for that. And I give an example, and the logical answer is if you're going to decommission a nuclear power station, why are you doing it in a hurry? The land is there. You just make it a safe store and you leave it for 100 years. Again, the same discussion. People don't like leaving problems for the next generation, but it's on the economics front that's true. But of course, you're then back in the whole discussion of which you discussed a few weeks and months ago about linear threshold and the fact that the only logic why nuclear disposal costs so much money is twofold: is the cost of disposal because of the limited size of decommissioning sites. The disposal sites in most of the world are very constrained and therefore expensive to use. Well, in South Africa, that's not a problem. We have 100 square kilometers. Literally, we have no shortage of ground.
Right. And
the second one is the belief that there is a linear threshold of health effects, and therefore getting that to absolute zero is the ideal solution. As soon as you put any kind of threshold which says that at 10 millisieverts or 100 millisieverts, you've reached a limit of any health effect, then suddenly your decommissioning costs collapse because you didn't go anywhere near as severe. So, whole pile of questions there, but it's sort of an argument that you never get people to pin it down.
Yeah, when I was in Ramsar in Iran, the background radiation is 250 millisieverts.
You're in Ramsar? Mind you flew there, so I'm not sure if you were safe flying either. It's a whole discussion of don't eat bananas. You're back in the discussion about what you should. I have a lovely diagram. We did it shortly after after Fukushima. I got a diagram somewhere on my PC. I may even bring it up if you want to be later on. But it was quite funny because I put up a walk. We got someone to walk from Kuba Power Station down the coast and back to his house with a guide counter. Let me see if I can find that. Pardon me 2 seconds. I'll just be if I'm and what was absolutely fascinating was that this thing came along that he bimbled along, and the radiation level on the beach was some ridiculous number, and then we had this lump of it going higher, quite high. Then he got back down to Danafontaine, which is the Eskom village, and he walked round the road and went higher again, not as high as the first time. And then in his house, it went ballistic. And the background was that the first step up was because he'd come to a granite monument on some shipwreck. And that was the first blip. Then he walked on a tarmac road, and the tarmac was radioactive compared to the sand. And lastly, he put the whole thing on his granite countertop in his kitchen. And so he pointed out that, clearly that if you believed that radiation was dangerous, his kitchen was more dangerous than Kubrick.
Well, yeah,
it could be true. I don't want to trust the guys too much, but let's not go down that line. But the answer is that if like Ramsar is a perfect example of extreme case. There's no evidence of any health effects from Ramsar. And that's my biggest complaint, is that if you believe in.
Well, to illustrate,
let's get back to cost.
Yeah. So yeah, let's get to
I think
cost, because I want to. So let me show you. Sorry, let me show you how I understand it. You tell me where I'm wrong. If I look at Google cost of nuclear power stations, they always come with $20-30 billion. Okay, that's sort of a price tag that's rounded up there. That might be wrong, So that's sort of what Google tells me, and then they say the next word, they say it's unaffordable, and then they sort of say the levelized cost is very high. So how do you make sense of all of that? Those numbers?
Okay. Well, the first thing is there are clearly 3 elements, or 3 or 4 elements to costing of a nuclear plant. The first element is clearly the capital cost of the plant, physically how much it costs to buy it, and the uncertainty in that. I'll come back to both of those in a second. The second one is the cost of the money that you're using to buy it with, and that can either be equity, in other words, you're putting your own money and you expect a return, or it can be a loan. And the next one is how long you want to recover and the next one obviously is operating cost of the plant, and that's pretty. And the last one is how long you can operate the plant to recover your money. Let me go through this a second. So let's look at the capital cost of the plant, and this is one of the funniest things you ever have, is that if you look at somebody who don't want to buy anything, you look for somebody who, and you're now a buyer. You're not a producer, you're not a developer, you're not doing your own thing. You're buying it as a commodity. The first thing to look for is who does most of this thing, who is the market leader, who's making it cost effective, and who's building a fleet, because one-offs don't make much sense. There's a crude rule of thumb that you're first of class, you're complete first of class, doesn't cost you anything to twice the cost of the straight machine development cost. The other thing to bear in mind is that if you look at all the build programs in the world, the first machine, between the first machine and the 6th machine, you'll probably have a price reduction of 40%. And there's a number of reasons for this. Now, let me look at this rabbit hole, and I'll come back to that cost second. The first of these rabbit holes is that you've got to license, set up the supply chain, sort all the variables out, get the design sorted out. And even if you're building a standardized machine, it's going to have some design localization issues.
Yeah.
And you've also got to set up the national infrastructure to do it. The owner's costs become quite high because you've got to put in place training. And a good example of that went wrong was the UAE with the BRCA project, and a lot of my friends were involved in that towards the end. And what happened there clearly was that BRCA negotiated a very good price for the plant with the Koreans. Koreans built it on time and schedule, but there was no company to accept it. No owners was set up, so it took literally about a 3-year delay while they sorted out the organization to run the plant. That's how I understand it. I could be slightly wrong, but that's broadly how I understand it. So if you look at the cost, if I look at very crude numbers, and you can add 20% of these, I would argue a couple of years ago, I'd have said that the actual material costs of a nuclear plant, i.e. if you're building the nth machine down the line, is about $2,000 a kilowatt. Maybe it's now 2.5. And that's supported by the nth machine costs in South Korea, in India, in China, and in Russia. Look at the cost they quote for their own domestic production. They're down about if you take the capital cost of the project and divide it by the megawatts, you get about $2,500 a kilowatt, maybe 2,000. At one point, the Chinese were claiming they were bringing in what they called CPR 1000s, which were basically the French 1,000 megawatt units that were in a license at about $1,070 a kilowatt. Okay, so that's your bare minimum. Now that presumes that you've got all your infrastructure set up, your supply chains are set up, your licensing is done, because all you're doing is saying, if you license 5 of these already, this one's the same as the last 5, and all the license authority is doing is confirming you're maintaining the quality. There's no question of reviewing every procedure, every document, because they're all the same. If you want to then say, I want to build one of the same design, but I want to build it in a foreign country, let's say Oman, let's say Egypt, let's say Turkey, the ones that are currently building, then you can add, in my view, another 2,000 on a good contract, and you can almost double that, another $2,000 a kilowatt. And that's the cost of setting up and establishing this whole thing. You've got to get a new licensing authority involved, and that is a lump of money. And I'm saying on the first 2, I'm basing it on 2 machines. You can argue that if it's 1 machine, it gets better. And essentially, you can then get to a point where, depending on how you do it and how you do the alignment with the original country, you've probably got another $2,500 on that. So you're looking at something between. So if you look at the world as a whole, if you look at the countries that are building plant today, you strip out all the other costs. I'm talking about contracts which have the first year's operation included in the contract, has the first 3 reloads, which is classical. Classical have the initial fuel load and the 3 reloads, which is 6 years of fuel included in the first contract. But if you take those sort of numbers out, you end up seeing that's the kind of number that the exports from Russia and China and Korea are coming in at. There's variations on that, but about that double. If you then decide to build your own machine from the beginning and have all the other things, and you've got to establish a new, and maybe there's, I'd make $6,000 a kilowatt if I'm starting, say, in France with a well-run EPR project. I would expect to have clearly the cost bit, clearly, and then the design and development cost, which comes another $2,000. So logically, I would argue that if you're building sensibly, and certainly evidence in the world supports this, and I'm probably numbers a couple of years old because inflation is now getting a bit worse, but looking at something like about $6,000 a kilowatt is if you're building a slightly odd machine and you're having to build the supply chain at the same time. If you're doing it and you're saying, I will take your off-the-shelf machine, but I'll bring my licensing authority in, I'm going to license it, but I'm going to accept up front that your basic machine is okay. I'm not going to re-engineer it. Then you end up with probably about $4,000, and when you get to the nth machine, you're probably at about $2,500. And that would support it. Now, the problem
so just to understand that, you would say first machine 6,000, then 4,000, then about 2,000, and sort of you don't get lower than 2,000.
If you're domestically building, if you're going to buy somebody's machine from an established supplier, but he hasn't built one of these before, you're about 6,000. If you're buying his standard machine off the shelf, a Russian VVR 1200, a Chinese Hualong 1, a South Korean APR 1400, those are off-the-shelf machines. So you've got the base cost plus the localization. You haven't got to re-engineer the machine, basically. If you decide to build a machine that no one's quite built before, I put it at 6,000. Now, you're then going to say to me, but I'm reading about the cost of Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C and Vogel and things, and heaven help us.
What is the thing in Finland?
Old Kloto 3 or Flammable 3. And the answer is that what you're looking at there is not the cost of an established supplier building a nuclear power station. You're absolutely looking at somebody starting from absolute scratch with no trade level skills, a lot of intellectual capability, but everything you touch is the first of a kind. So you literally come along and you find that you've never learned before. You're learning all those mistakes you learn in first of a class squared.
Yeah. That was experience that I had on Hinkley Point. Yeah.
Right. And I will tell you, Hinkley Point is, and they may have, and I think the discussions of the fact that I'm hearing numbers that Sizewell C could be 40% less than Hinkley Point C makes complete sense to me. Because all those lessons, when you suddenly find it doesn't fit, you haven't got to. There's all those problems in a first of a class where you suddenly find that 2 people have slightly different views and it doesn't fit in the hole you made for. The very famous one, which I'll give you 2 famous ones. One's an aeroplane and one's a power station. Dungeness B, which you may have heard of, was one of the British, and they actually built the boilers to go into the pressure vessel wall. I don't even know how they worked out there. They've actually got a very thick pressure vessel, and they put the boilers go in the pressure vessel walls, and they realized there are different drawings for the pressure vessel walls the pressure vessel manufacturers. A civil guy had. They'd changed it, and that meant it didn't fit the hole. And these aren't small things. This is not like, oh dear, I better go get my new. And all that was famous was the Airbus 380, where I think it was the Germans had done the wiring loom on the main body of the fuselage. I think it came from Germany, and the French had done the nose or something. And again, they actually got the drawings wrong, different versions of the drawings. So I had to strip out all the wiring, which in an airliner for entertainment systems is unbelievable. And that's one of the big problems with that. So if I look at the projects that you really mustn't use as a reference, it is Vogel, Hinkley Point C, Flamanville, Old Cloto. Those are the ones that basically are copy, the way not to do it. It's the same way as ESCOM did when it did Medupi and Cassini. It learned all kinds of lessons, and probably if it built ESCOM built another 6-pack hull, say the same design, we'd start getting the cost under control. But you had both the problem of lack of experience when you start up. And that's why, if you look at the Russians, for example, you'll see that their early machines, it wasn't a cost issue because they absorbed the problems, but the Kulim, I can never pronounce it properly, but the first export machine they did was after the end of the Soviet Union, when they started up again. Rostom started up again as it was then the Minotom, but they started up in let's say 98 or something, selling machines to the Indians. They had all kinds of stupid problems they hit, which meant those machines were overdue. I'll give you an example I heard beautifully. The Russians were used to shipping components around the Soviet Union and its neighbors. Every single thing went on a barge or went on a railway. So when you ship your weatherproofing for your steam generators is reasonable, but not overwhelming. When you ship it to India, it goes by sea. So when the SGs first arrived, I think it was India, maybe the Tiananmen plant in China. When they first arrived, they had to plug a whole pile of tubes because they corroded them. I suspect the Russians now have so much environmental protection on the stuff they're shipping overseas to be unbelievable, because they learned that lesson. That's how you learn lessons. But those first machines. So at the moment,
it's a painful lesson.
It's many lessons in painful. When you do big projects, you get painful lessons. It's how you handle the lessons that resolve your future. Only idiots repeat the same thing over and over again, in which case you want to. So, I've always said, if you want to buy a nuclear power station, there are 5 things you need to look for in the nuclear power station. Now, I'm talking about a country like South Africa, importing it, not looking at a domestic program. That comes later. The first one is you want a machine that's actually being built. You want a machine that somebody actually is physically pouring concrete on now, or has just finished pouring concrete. That avoids the problem of slight design change where things don't quite fit in the hole, to use example. Yeah. I mean, Dungeon was famous for it being a disaster, but it applies to us. So you want to say, and I want exactly that machine. Also, because you can't specify the machine. When you buy a motor car, you don't specify a motor car. You say, I trust BMW. I'm buying a 320. Therefore, I want a 320 like your other BM 320s. I don't want made to measure for me. I get the new, right. And then I will tell you I'll have these 5 options. So the first one is you're building something. I'm not having any foot. So bring me a piece of paper and saying, so that's brilliant design of the world, licensed by whoever you want to get licensed by, reviewed by everyone in this world. Interesting. You will still have pain the first time you build it. When you've got through the first one, as long as it's a year ahead of me in the build, needing even started building it. As long as you're ahead of me in your build, you will find those problems and fix them. And none of them are major problems. Fundamentals designs are good. People don't design bad nuclear reactors nowadays. Well, not that I know of. But it's those mundane things of life of it doesn't actually fit in the hole. That's the first one. Second one is you would love to have it as part of a domestic series that the vendor's building. In other words, if you need a spare part, I'll give you an example of that. When Coburg was being built, we had one of the steam generators had a twist in the tube bundle, a long big tube bundle twist in it, which the French at the time said this is not the specification doesn't include that as a spec, therefore it's okay. So ESCOM must have been about 1980 rejected this and said, or 1970 rejected it, said no. But because the French were then building a series of the same reactor, they just said, okay, we'll give you one from another unit and they'll take yours.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, if you're building a big component with an 18-month lead time and that component fails QA test, then what do you do with it? And the answer is, if you're just the only one being built, then you've got to start 18 months and build another one, which is a scheduled disaster. If they're building one of these reactors every 3 months, then you can just accelerate that production line slightly and get one out. So that's the second one. Have a serious production.
Yeah.
And also with that is the fact you've got the support of the vendor, that when you've got a problem, he can come in and say, I'll help you. And you aren't the only guy. Third one is I'd like any vendor I'm dealing with to have actually built a machine of a similar sort of size and scale in the last 10 years or so, vaguely on time and schedule, not precisely on time and schedule, not every single one, because things happen like COVID. But if you've not got any machine that's on time and on schedule in the last 10 years, I must question whether I'm the first one you're going to do on time.
Yeah, reliability, yeah.
Yeah. The next one is I'd love you to have had some export work already. Because the problem of not having previous export is you don't think everything through. And I'll give you a really stupid example of this, but it's quite a funny one. When Coburg was being built, Framatome had the Framatome or EDF supplied the beam to lift things into containment. Right, this is a massive great beam to lift pressure vessel things, and the French industry actually only had one of these, and it was shipped around France. There was somebody in the head office of Framatome or EDF that had a big board on the wall where this thing was and who it was lifting next week, because they took me. And of course, the problem was that when that was forgotten about when they placed the contract for Coburg, and then somebody a bit later pointed out, well, when do you want this for the Coburg plant? We want on site for these periods over the next couple of years. And someone said, well, it's a bit different shipping it from Marseille to Lyon than shipping it from Marseille to Cape Town. You know, one is a weekend event and one is like 3 months. And then you've got to buy another one. No, but yeah. That's the point. You don't. I'll give another stupid example. Which is just learning silly lessons. It's a digression. But when Eskom ordered some gas turbines the first time, they had LPG startup gas. So when you start this big gas turbine up, the first thing you do is put LPG in there, get it started, and then when you've been running when it's up to, you transfer it to diesel fuel, right? Eskom was very concerned about diesel fuel. Didn't even realize that LPG was involved. We had these machines running, and somebody suddenly said the LPG's run out. And someone said, "Pardon?" It was on first machines. Pardon? No, we had a sort of 100 shots of LPG came as the supply in the tank we first got the machine, but no one's filled it since we bought the machine, and it's now empty. And they went, "Oh my God!" And suddenly, LPG became the thing of the month. Now, it only happens once, hopefully. But if it's your first of a class, that's kind of problem they've hit with. I'll give you an example I heard of, just a stupid example. I heard of one of the reasons for Vogel being delayed was somebody in Westinghouse had put in the bend radius, and I'm quoting bad numbers here, the bend radius on the rebar was, 40 millimeters or something.
Yeah.
They didn't put 40 millimeters plus or minus 10%. They didn't put 40 millimeters on average across the fleet. They put 40 millimeters. They got a license on that basis. The NRC then said, "Excuse me, we're measuring your rebar bends. This one's 38, 39. This one's 42. This one, so you better rebend them all." And it's it would just, you get, that's the kind of problem.
That's just a ridiculous thing, but yeah, Yeah,
no. But you don't think about it because to you it's obvious no one would be serious about that. So you want a fleet being built domestically. You also want the intellectual property to be controlled by the country selling it to you. Because you're going to have to, because nuclear intellectual property is very, very touchy. And if you're dealing with somebody, you've got to keep a good relationship with them, because if they walk away, you have got a problem. You cannot do a grey market supply of nuclear bits. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
And so you've got to let you in yourself as the buyer and the supplying country. Now, if they are dependent on a third country for some of the equipment and the IP, then you've got to have an agreement between yourself and the buying and the supplier, yourself and the other country which is supplying this IP, and the other country. So you've got 3 relationships to maintain, not one. And politics gets involved in nuclear, whether they like it or not. So that's sort of a bit of the discussion of who you choose. And I'm afraid at the moment that puts you down largely with Probably the Russians and the Chinese, they're in serious construction and they've got down to a reasonably fine art now. And South Koreans are also very, very competent. And I said that their job in Abu Dhabi has been excellent from the construction point of view.
Okay.
They've had problems in the operating and maintenance side. They had a lot of expert support in. So that's sort of the capital side of things. And therefore you can look at the world as a whole and say, well, the capital cost should be, let's say, $5,000 a kilowatt. I'm going to go back a couple of years. I'm going to let you go back 2 years because the last year or so inflation, I'm sure numbers are moving, but let's just take it to $5,000 a kilowatt. The next key question, which comes to economics, is you've now got a debt. You've got to fund this. And if you're running it as a state, and if you look at the OECD data, for example, the NEA, same thing, what they do is they use different discount rates depending on who you are. In other words, if you're a free market IPP, you might want 9% return, real return investment. If you're a complete state organ, 3% might be fine. And bearing in mind that the cost of debt from US bonds, for example, has been negative. European costs have been negative for different periods and changing a lot. But even now, we're looking at inflation rates in Europe and the States that are higher than the federal bond rate.
So you would need a rate of 3% to pay back, the capex, possibly less than.
Well, what I'm saying is, whatever you calculate, you come out with the figure. If you use 3%, that's to me not a bad number to use. But when someone puts 8% in, you find that the cost of the plant. If I took 3% and 9%, for example, 9% being the high end of a thing, then as most of the cost of a plant is actually the repayment of the capital, then you've got 3 times the cost of the plant. I haven't changed a single bolt or washer or single bill, but I made the price 3 times as high. What I've also done is if the tariff is based on the nominal cost you've now declared, and you've actually borrowed your money at 3% or less, then you are making, and 2/3 of your income is profit. Right?
That's interesting.
So the second thing is what cost of capital, and quite bluntly, again, as an import country, it's extremely easy. Everybody who buys an imported nuclear power station gets what's called export credit agency financing, which essentially is state-backed loans, which normally come in at essentially what you would consider concessional rates. And this is classical. It's how you buy. It's how heavy items are exported from almost all countries. For example, could be a good example, in the US, their Exim Bank, which is their export-import bank, its biggest single user is Boeing. Because when you buy a Boeing airliner, it comes from the USA with a loan package which Boeing organizes, not from Boeing, but from and those banks that give the loan are backed by the Exim Bank that guarantees, and they are extremely competitive interest rates. And so the question you ask yourself is, okay, how long am I going to pay the money back for and everything else? Classically, about 3% interest rate and about an 18 years repayment from the day the machine starts up. Nominally, you have 85% of the imported goods covered by this financing. In reality, most clever financing organizations can raise as near as damn it 100% financing for your deal. When Bangladesh ordered their nuclear power stations from Russia, they in fact got loan finance for the development work at the beginning before they placed the contract. They got $500 million lent them by the Russians to do the development work on the whole process. So those are sort of the couple of things coming now. So if you ask 2 different people, and I'm sure you've had arguments with people who say nuclear is way too expensive. They say, look at the price of Flamanville, look at the price of Olkiluoto, look at the price of Hinkley Point C, look at the price of Vogel. And my answer is, yeah, I can make a mistake. Look at who's doing it well. And look at the price of the Turkish project, the Turkish 4 VVRs, the Pakistan is building Karachi 2 and 3, the Bangladesh with Rampur 1, 2, and so on and Belarus. And you find that these are largely on schedule and on budget. In fact, they're largely sold with fixed price contracts. Not quite fixed price, they end up being indexed to inflation rates, but that's in real terms, they're fixed. And again, you could do that because they bring the design. You aren't saying, I'm not going to make a bespoke machine. If it's a bespoke machine, you pay all the costs. And so essentially I can take a machine and argue in South African rand terms, looking at numbers a couple of days ago. I will flash up briefly. I'll give you an example if I can. Yeah, let's flash this up. Pardon me as I flash something up. Have I got a curve here? Yeah. Can I just display? Let me just I'm just going to display. Oh, let's try a second. I may have got this all wrong. If my machine explodes on me, I'll blame somebody else. What am I now? Okay. I'm going to say present. What's it doing now? Slides. Nice. Oh, my computer. What am I doing here? This is a new thing for me. I'm going to upload.
Yeah, StreamYard is not like Zoom. It's got a few different places to look.
Okay, you've now got me all excited. Bear with me a second. I'm getting there. You've now got me excited because I'm. But what I just want to share, because it's a very interesting graph that I quite like and I use it quite regularly. And I think it's going to be useful for this discussion. I'll put this one up.
We already have an audience questions for you as well, so people are asking.
Okay, that's no problem. That's all. So what's it doing now? I should be saying, oh, it's coming up with, it's talking to itself now. I'm uploading to your system. Don't ask me how this is happening. This is a new approach for me. But I think it's worth. But the point is that if you, and it's important to bear in mind.
There we go. Some thoughts on the discussion.
Flash these, just pour some really boring stuff about what's actually going on. This is an interesting graph. You want to say nuclear is expensive. This happens to be some statistical data from 2023, and it happened in countries' household electricity prices, reference point just for June of last year. And what's interesting is I happened to pull this thing up, and when I'd done this graph, and there's South Africa there, I suddenly dawned on me that these ones down here, which is Russia, India, China, Turkey, UAE, and South Korea, are all actually currently building nuclear power stations.
So the cheapest electricity power cost of building nuclear.
Doesn't really make sense. Are you with me?
And I can the most expensive on your graph is most expensive.
Oh, obviously Germany and Denmark. That's what I just took.
In the UK.
That wasn't
the renewable guys. Okay.
This just is the cost of installation, and that's just OECD. Oh, this is an interesting one. If you look at the Business Times in Financial Times in 2019, but it said that 15% cost more than $5,500 a kilowatt. 45% was between 5.5 and 3.5, and 40% was below 3.5, which is Phil's underlined earlier that says that the domestic programs sit down here with the 3,500, and there's the few which are 9,000-12,000 who quote those numbers. It's meaningless if you do buy a first of a class from an inexperienced constructor, somebody who hasn't built one in the last 10 years, you will get those prices. But if you choose
you'll get the same price if you do it for any technology. It's a comparable price,
So, exactly. No, that's how you. This is that graph coming up clearly?
Yeah,
what is interesting is that this one's interesting because this graph is interesting. It assumes it's looking at the capex of a project versus the net discount rate versus the levelized cost, and it assumes the capex. The capex includes the owner's cost, so it's not the EPC contract cost. It's the entire project cost, which should be about 90% EPC contract if you're going for a proper EPC contract. Yeah. And what's interesting is my mouse on the picture or not?
No, I don't think I can see it. But
okay. Well, the top line is $6,000 a kilowatt, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is this dotted line here. The right-hand dotted line is in the South African resource plan. They assume the cost of capital. All these numbers are real, not nominal. You understand the real versus nominal discussion. Well, they should make 8.2% nominal. I would argue that the actual ECA cost of capital is below 3%. In fact, I can show that quite nicely. It's below 3%. But again, this model is very simple. This model just presumes this is the cost of recovery of your debt over time, and the time in question is 60 years. Life of the plant takes 6 years to build the plant. Assumes a linear build program. Don't wait too much. What's interesting is that I'm here sitting in rand terms at about 1,800 rand a kilowatt hour, a megawatt hour, which is about £1.80 a kilowatt hour. So it's about the same price as we're now getting quoted for the risk mitigation projects, which are dispatchable plant. But exactly the same power station with the same input costs comes down to something like about 900 if you're assuming the costing is at state cost levels. So you halve the price by changing the discount rate. And what you also see is that essentially this axis here, the axis got on cost of capital, discount rate, is way more important than the cost of the plant. And it's some people don't really recognize. So and it looks like some minor financial discussion of, are we at 9% or 6% discount rate? It makes an absolutely unbelievable difference.
That's just because of the exponential function, yeah. Oh,
it's loan finances. And what's of course interesting, if you assume your actual cost of debt on this $6,000, this is $6,000 a kilowatt, which is, I would say, the high end of any option that you're credible. This is 2,500 at the bottom. The blue line at the bottom is 2,500, which I'd argue is the kind of cost that the domestic build programs in Russia, South Korea, China, India are generating.
That's the blue. Which blue line is that? The one in the middle, or
the bottom line? The very bottom line is $2,500 a kilowatt.
Okay.
You see the horizontal lines, the curvy lines are, each one is a cost of capital for the machines, right?
Yeah.
So the bottom line is the cheapest. So $2,500 a kilowatt, which is the kind of price that the domestic programs in Russia, China, South Korea are going for. They are looking realistically, they're down at about, let's say, 600 rand a megawatt hour, 60 cents a unit.
Okay,
whereas if you go, but it's interesting that I can get, if I demand that even at $2,500 a kilowatt, if I want 10% cost of capital, again over 60 years, then I end up with something like 11, 12, £1.20 a unit. Whereas if I take a $6,000 a kilowatt, which is almost 3 times the price of a machine, but I bring the cost of debt down to 2%, I end up still at about $800 a megawatt hour. So it's an interesting example that the dominant discussion is the cost of financing, not the cost of the machine. I mean, the cost of the machine is important, but it doesn't dominate. What dominates it is the cost of debt. And everyone who's bought an export machine has had export credit financing in a kind of region of, in real terms, close to 2% or less. Now I put on this $20 a megawatt hour for the cost of O&M and fuel. That's an assumption I make. It's not out of line with the US practice. It's not in line with what we're getting for Coburg. We're getting for Coburg. I can't speak for the last few years, but that's so. Those numbers aren't really argued much.
Okay, that's a very important chart for people who dispute this. And does this cost? I mean, it includes all the costs throughout the lifetime of the project, right?
Yeah, the $20. I mean, the $20. Well, actually, the $20 a megawatt hour is the operating fuel and maintenance and everything else.
Sure.
I don't think it hasn't got decommissioning in. It hasn't got decommissioning.
The argument that people throw back at this would be, they say towards the end of the life that there's going to be refurbishments, replacement of steam generators, all of that type of thing, and that's never accounted for in any of these costs. Well, what would you say to that?
Okay, to answer that question, and I'll answer it. First of all, we did the costing of Coburg and extending the life by another 20 years at a cost 20 billion rand, and it was a no-brainer. It was the best business case you can make. The real answer is that discounting takes it out. So but also almost all the upgrading on current nuclear power stations is because of errors made in material selection back in the 1970s. So I'll give you an example of that. Steam generator changeout, which is a big expensive item that everyone talks about as the big item. Mm-hmm. Back in the 1970s, there was a material called Inconel 600 millennial. I won't bore you what it is. It's a nickel-based alloy, which was seen to be absolutely beautiful. And so the steam generators were made of this stuff across the world, across the Western world, the non-German Western world, if I can use that phraseology, pardon me, pedantic. So the Germans used a thing called Inkalloy 800. We didn't have this problem. The Russians used something else, but the Westinghouse and Combustion Engineering and all of Framatome all used Inconel 600. And by about the early 1980s, people suddenly realized that there was a stress corrosion cracking problem in these SGs, and they were starting to crack. So starting as early as probably about 1990, people started changing these steam generators for new steam generators with an Inconel 690 material. I won't bore you with all the which actually doesn't have this problem, and those SGs should last like forever. There's no degradation mode. So a lot of these things you're changing, and I use Coburg as an example. You're seeing things being changed out, which if we'd known now what we knew, if we knew back in 1970 when we specified the plant, what we know today, wouldn't have had to change out. So there isn't the major refurbishment is a function of the designs being what's the word?
Well, I mean, I don't think people at that time foresaw these life. I mean, you can't foresee the problem, so it's a problem. So it's learning experiences, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, we've learned that now. So if you build, if you build an SG, a new nuclear reactor today, your simulator should have no problem lasting the entire life of 60 or 100 years. That's no problem at all. And the Germans had no problem with their SGs. Inkalloy 800 was different. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Oh, I clicked on. Oh, you're clicking on it. You're looking at it. Okay, fine.
Sorry,
I thought I was doing that. No, it's not bad regardless. I want to. So the refurbishment is normal maintenance. You do it, but it's not a big deal in the discussion. The amount of money flowing around these things, midlife problems aren't a problem to power stations. Go to the next slide. You were playing now. What's the next slide got on it? Just light-heartedly interesting. So what else? That's just proof that Eskom. When someone says, "Oh, but these interest rates are all mythical," this actually is extract of Eskom's annual report of 2020. And if you look at the light blue column on the left-hand side, you will see this is export credit agency financing to Eskom. I mentioned it earlier. Cost of debt. Normally, export credit agency financing for nuclear plant, you will only start repaying when the machine goes online, a year after startup. So when revenue is coming in, and you're on 18 years to repay. So you can refinance it. But look at those interest rates. Japanese yen, 1.49, euros 1.25, euros 0.57, euros 4. That's expensive. Oh, the rand one is even rand. It's about 3% real.
Oh,
that's the domestic. Okay. But if you think about US inflation, is currently running for the last 10 years around at about 2% before the present spike. So essentially, someone in the US lending us money at zero interest, real interest rates.
Well, I had an interesting conversation here with an economist, Charlie Robinson, on interest rates, and he makes the argument that interest rates of a country is a function of their fertility. So there's a correlation, one-to-one correlation. All Western countries have fertility rates below 2. Interest rates are below 2. Actually less than
okay.
So he made that argument that if population projections are to be continued, interest rates will stay low. So that favors the nuclear environment, because if you think of it logically, those countries have lots of savings. If you don't have children, you start saving more money. Yeah. So they're living off their savings. They've got a lot of money to invest. So you're making the argument that because the interest rate environment's very low, it actually favors the nuclear investment.
You can't. Just of interest, while you flip forward, I'm intrigued, you guys. This one's interesting. This is just, everyone says we can't roll out nuclear fast enough to actually meet the needs. This is a graph again. The bottom says where it came from. It's essentially extracted from the who is it? British BP's data series they publish every year. And what's interesting is how fast countries have deployed in terms of production of megawatt hours per capita over a 10-year period, different technologies. And what's really interesting is the bottom of this thing is entirely made up of nuclear and hydro. In other words, if you want to say rollouts quick, the history example is Norway in hydro, Sweden in nuclear, France in nuclear, Finland in nuclear, Canada in hydro, Belgium in nuclear, Switzerland in nuclear, and so on. All those, the bottom ones go upwards. The fastest rollout of replacement energy was by nuclear and hydro. And the wind doesn't even get on the table.
That's heresy today, to the environmentalists.
Oh, I am
Okay.
deep in heresy, Hugo. You must guess that. You didn't ask me on here to have a discussion completely. You got me going. What's my next slide? You got me. Oh, that's just the construction bit. This happens again from the IEA data. Just looking over a period of time, and I forget when I did this, but there you are. If you get it right, construction should take about 5 years. That's from when you first pour concrete until the machine makes power. There are anomalies sitting in the middle of here, which you can explain away, and I'll give you a funny one. Those two red ones are
But
Kuba.
have recent plants been completed on that time? On 5? Isn't it 7, 8?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Well, but you're being Eurocentric and Western centric there. If you ask the Russians how they're doing with Turkey and Egypt and everywhere else, they'll say they're on schedule. The Chinese are on schedule. The Koreans had a political change where it stopped their whole program for some years ago, but they actually built Braca on schedule. They just couldn't start up because they hadn't got licenses because of their organizational issues. But yeah, if you want to choose the Western ones, nothing's on schedule.
So you would ask the question.
Like,
what's wrong with the Western people?
A bit like saying, well, but they have a view which says that because it's difficult to build the first couple, then you should never build anything. It's like me saying you should never buy a motor car because British Leyland in the 1970s built rust buckets that never worked. So I should never buy a motor car.
But if private, so I think this is sort of where the problem comes in, because Western finances, a lot of it's private finances, they would ask these questions, and they would say, but why should I put my money in a project if I get my money back after 7 years only, it starts paying back, and after 5 or whatever it might be, and if I only break even after 25 years? I mean, is there something that private finance can come into, or does it have to be state driven?
I think you can safely assume that nuclear, massive projects, be they nuclear or large hydro, and I use those two examples, are almost entirely state-backed. And where they're not state-backed in terms of state ownership, they have state support in the form of guarantees. But in South Africa, for example, we can't get renewables going without state subsidies. The whole renewable program in South Africa, which is seen as a success, and across the world, in fact, is based upon tax breaks and fixed prices, and which are not market related.
Yeah, the industry sector always is dependent on major state interventions in the economy. Right. Doesn't matter what anyone tells me. I've not seen a single country, including the United States, that haven't achieved it. So it's heresy basically to say that. But
I'm deep in heresy. I'll give you another heresy. Everyone quotes the Vietnamese as being a rollout of PV in a massive scale very quickly, absolutely massive scale. Yes. And everyone says, you see, it can be done. And there's a few minor problems in that discussion, because they did it by offering a 20-year feed-in tariff at 25% above the domestic tariff in the country.
That's to incentivize. Okay, so they gave them 25%.
And profit. It was 4 times the tariff that Eskom was being quoted for the last set of. That's incentivized gone mad. No. There were 4 times the price of, when open bidding for solar projects in South Africa is 1/4 the price of the price they quoted these PPAs were based on. And having done all that lot, and I'm speaking from memory here, when that lot came to an end, they got 20,000 megawatts. A large chunk is not being used because they can't use it. But also in the next 10-year plan issued by the government, there is a grand total of 700 megawatts more of solar planned. 12,000 megawatts of more coal, 20,000 megawatts more natural gas.
Okay.
So excuse me, no, that was not a commercial. I haven't seen the accountants. I'm sure the accountants are tearing their hair out with that one. But essentially, the answer is that you need power at 24/7. I've heard that rumor somewhere. And the problem is the sun goes down the same time across the country.
Yeah.
Maybe less so if you're Russia, but even Russia is pushing it a bit to have a power line across the whole country.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So
you've got to go to batteries again.
And have they cost gone down? I mean, what is the? I mean, because you're not giving the cost per kilowatt hour here, How does this compare
Right,
then to the alternatives?
okay, let me start cost per kilowatt. I estimate that you, and say, given the numbers we've got here, these sort of points here of where do you want to, what assumptions do you want to live with, right? Here, right? Then my answer is: Are you here down at the bottom of the $2,500 a kilowatt mass-produced machine with low cost of capital running in at, let's say, 500 rand a megawatt hour, which is 57 cents a unit, which is something like 3 cents US? Or are we sitting up here with $2,200 a kilowatt, which is literally 4 times as much? One makes no sense. One is the only answer you can choose. But in terms of batteries, it's very interesting. If you're going to do battery studies sensibly, what you'll find is that for batteries with batteries and wind to make a credible mixture that supports a normal grid situation, they're talking about you've got to get the battery cost per kilowatt hour of storage down to between about $50 to $100 a kilowatt hour storage. Yeah. At that point, apparently, and I've done this on myself, that batteries start really taking over the world. Now, Eskom is just going through a process as we speak, looking for a large battery service with, I think, about 1,500 megawatt hours of battery storage and about 400 megawatt electrical output. And they're looking at it, and the total cost they expect to spend on this is 11 billion rand. I heard figures of 11 to 15. They've quoted 11. I've heard numbers of 15 billion rand. That would end up, those numbers would end up giving you a cost per kilowatt hour storage of in the order of over 400 rand dollars a megawatt hour. So essentially, battery system costs are at the present moment something like about 8 times where they have to be to actually really change the economics of power systems. And I'll give you another quick thought on that one, if I may. You drive a motor car, correctly, Hugo?
I don't own one at the moment, but I have a license. Yeah.
Okay.
With public transport in France. So, yeah.
Sorry, I will do myself there. I can't pick on you. I drive a Volvo at the moment, diesel. I would argue that motor car companies have 2 criteria. One is they're as cost competitive as they can be. Every dollar they can save on a car, they will do. And they're also quite prepared to be really high tech. Some of the things in the modern motor cars are really high tech. So the battery in my car as energy storage to start my diesel engine up must be the lowest cost, irrespective of technology that I can have in my car. Does that sound reasonable, Hugo?
Yeah, I mean, unless I want to go for more expensive option for the looks, you know.
But they won't. Lithium, it's a lead acid battery.
Yeah.
Lead acid. Invented in 1859.
Yep.
So we haven't moved, and the cost of it is dominated by the cost of lead. Now you might say, but lithium ion is getting cheaper, and it is getting cheaper. Well, it was getting cheaper until a couple of years ago, but even so, it's still not competitive as a low-cost energy source. If you look at lifetime, it comes a bit cheaper, yes. But the real answer is it's stabilized. 85% of the cost of lithium-ion battery is still lithium and cobalt, mainly cobalt and nickel and other things. And so, excuse me, they've got to a point where the IP cost, which is the bit you can learn very easily, is gone. We're now down to bulk manufacturing. So batteries are not
even there, you're going to hit. I mean, this was an argument that came years ago, so I don't know if it was proven or not, but it's that all technologies, you have an S-curve, learning curve.
Yeah.
And they hit physical limits eventually. You can't squeeze more blood out of the rock, basically.
Yeah.
And you can maybe get mass production and improve your process, but you get to a point where, even there's no optimization.
When your input cost of raw materials are limiting you, you cannot get the raw materials down unless you can find a cheaper way to mine these materials. Okay. Sorry, my grandson just turned up on the right-hand side. He just left. So essentially, batteries are reaching down to the point of being the problem with solar panels and things is not the efficiency of the solar panel. It's just simply the fact that it only makes power for like 8 hours a day. You know, when people say they keep the lights on with solar panels, actually the lights on with batteries. Solar panels are not going to help you when the sun's gone down. I've heard rumors the sun goes down in most
the
parts
argument
of the world
they've made, the other argument they've made is they say that you can have a correct combination of batteries and wind. And there's wind at night in many places in the country, and then theoretically you only have to take the difference between the peaks. Or when there's really a Dunkelflaute, like in Germany, you take gas.
Yeah.
That's been a combination system.
No. You can't have gas. Sorry. You've just declared net zero. If we accept carbon capture and storage is an amusing idea, then you've got to recognize that when you get to this 2050, which is in only 25 years away, it's close, it's in time schedule, then you essentially going to stay in a situation where you can't have any combustion system, and you've got at least twice as much demand on the grid, because everything currently done by combustion fuels in the rest of the society is now done electrically. So no, gas is not going anywhere. And the European price of gas will tell you recently there's been I gather last year the price of gas went up quite dramatically.
Yeah, it's
come down because there's been a glut because everyone but it's a classical situation. The idea of gas being long-term cheap and also, unless you've got gas in your backyard.
So if if South Africa were to go now, say, for another nuclear plant, I mean, I would assume you wouldn't say we should just build willy-nilly 10 or million of these things. We should do it sensibly, one in a decade, or how would you proceed?
I'm just going to first of all, let me just how do I stop sharing? I can't find a stop sharing button. Or I stopped sharing already?
I think I have to stop.
You're in charge of the universe.
Yeah, I'm in charge of this one. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, it was distracting. Look, I mean, the short answer, I think there's a couple of points here to bear in my mind. First point to bear in mind is that I'm not going to talk South Africa specifically because I can speak. The first point is that I think the power supply is something which the free market should be allowed to trade in that area on a commercial basis. So the correct price for grid expansion, the correct price for transmission costs, the correct price over the day for electricity. But the state and I think South Africa is a wonderful example from the 90 energy policy, is if you haven't got power, electricity, then the state is going to fail. We're seeing it now in South Africa, literally. And therefore, the state has to take accountability for making power up. And I think, therefore, that you've got to recognize that and the state should do the things the state does best, which is the big major projects. So my answer in South Africa, at the moment particularly, is we should start a credible build program with an aim to be replacing a large chunk of our coal fleet by the mid-2040s. And I believe that once you start that, you can ramp it up or ramp it down. So I'd be aiming for, if someone said, give me a plan in the next 30 seconds, and I haven't worked it, I'd be saying I'd like to put a machine on load every year. 1,200 megawatt machine every year for the next, 25 years.
But that takes a lot of cost. Isn't that a bit of an ambitious plan?
No, it's very reasonable. It's what the Koreans did. But I mean, you've got to replace the current power. I mean, you must remember that we always forget that we're living in this country in South Africa on the back that in the 1980s, over 40% of the fixed capital investment in the country was done by Eskom.
Yeah.
Eskom was literally had 35,000 megawatts under construction. And the problem we've now got is that we are losing those megawatts at the rate we put them in. So forget about growth for a second. South Africa literally is looking at a situation where we were commissioning 2,000 megawatts a year in the 1970s and 80s of new plant. That plant is now, old plant is going out of service. So again, this point that the 90 energy policy, it seemed easy because all these plants were quite young, but unfortunately, by the time policies work through 20 years later, they're now getting somewhat aged, and so we got the problem. So no, that's the reality of investment. And the short answer is
I say it's not just South Africa there. I mean, France is having a similar issue. They built most of their nukes in the 80s. I think the 90s they finished building them. Now the refurbishment plants are starting.
They're lucky that they're nuclear, and therefore they're going life extension. I mean, the other thing is the kind of plant that Coburg is, and that sort of what I call Gen 2 reactors, these sort of Westinghouse 3-loop PWRs, which is where the French have, and 4-loopers, and South Africa has, and most of the world has, have been shown to have almost no obvious end of life. You can upgrade now. So the joy is you can do life extension on these things for an extremely long time. And nobody has yet shut down what I call a Generation 2 reactor for technical reasons. Politics has shut them down. Look at the German example, is the obvious one to point at. But even now in Belgium, they're shutting down their older nuclear units, and they're keeping 2 for a couple more years. I mean, the insanity of the policy. But if the Belgians wanted to, they could run those machines on to 80 years.
Yeah,
there's no great problem doing that. I mean, it's not trivial, and it needs good management. But we've shown it can be done quite effectively. But it's worth bearing in mind that if you want to replace the fleet as we know, you look at the rate at which we're bringing nuclear plant into the world in the 1980s, in the early 80s to mid 80s. That rate of commissioning will be adequate to meet the needs for the world to solve its problems. So we've done it before. It's not like people saying we're going to build batteries at a scale that no one's ever seen before. We were in the mid 1980s. Commissioning of 60% of all the new plant being commissioned in the States in that period was nuclear. And they cancelled the vast chunk of their nuclear plants as well, largely for economics because of the slowdown post-79 oil crisis.
Yeah,
and
oil crisis
because the
knocked
US were organizing it didn't work.
But I mean, these are ultimately policy decisions.
And you've seen that the
losing connection there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had a bit of delay there for seconds. So these are ultimately policy decisions South Africa needs to take, but it requires major state spending, on whatever approach going forward. Now, the question I just had for the renewable guys is this. I haven't seen a renewable plant that has a lifetime of more than 15 to 20 years. So what do you do after a decade?
Yeah.
Assuming all of those questions that we have raised are nonsense. You have to rebuild them every decade. I mean, all your electricity infrastructure. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I mean, I know how to decommission nuclear plants. I mean, it's been done. It's been done in the world. Gen 2 machines have been shut down, decommissioned. And they don't cover that much area. So, there's some plants in the world that have been put in safe store where basically they've shut the station down and almost locked the doors and walked away. Not quite walked away, but but no, I think we recognize the costs it is to run our society. And the amount of money Eskom and the government in South Africa is now spending supporting the renewable projects, I think is extremely large. That would have funded a nuclear project quite comfortably. I'll give you an example of some numbers. There was the famous Russian nuclear deal, which wasn't really a Russian nuclear deal. It was an open tender deal, but never mind. Let's call it the Russian nuclear deal, which was nominally 9,600 megawatts. And it was nominally going to be a trillion rand was being quoted. And that would be a trillion rand financed by the vendor over a period of 15 years. In other words, building in 15 years. And that was clearly going to bankrupt South Africa. We've now got, and that was, we knew how to fund it, we knew what came out of it, we had to manage it. We've now got the Just Energy Transition, which everyone's very proud of, which has a plan, an investment, JET IP investment plan, which is spend 1.5 trillion rand by 2027, which is 3 years away. So it's 50% bigger than the nuclear deal over 1/5 the time. They've no idea how they're going to fund it. And they've no idea who's going to do it. And they've got no idea how much benefit it'll really gain. But it's okay. So I'd argue that the unaffordability is a political thing to say, and every single one of those funds will have some kind of sovereign guarantee behind it. Even the free market stuff with sovereign guarantee. Well, if you argue sovereign guarantees, then you can give them to a state corporation and they'll do it for you as well. And they'll do it at low interest rates. So I think the hypocrisy is overwhelming.
And often it's not even private contractors doing it. It's multinational corporations that, if you look very deeply, they stay back.
The best thing is one of the big players is, and I'm nothing against EDF, please don't misunderstand me, but one of the big players in the South African IPP market is EDF, which is a predominantly nuclear French state corporation.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The British tried to privatize their nuclear power industry. It ended up being owned by EDF of France, which is a state corporation. The level of illogical. You mentioned there's some questions. My time is not. Any questions?
Well,
the chat box. I'm sorry, I can't.
So people were asking questions. I don't think it's not that well. We see it's relevant. So people say, how does these costs compare to SMRs? I mean, you were managing the pebble bed at the stage, like.
I started the pebble bed project. I'd argue the pebble bed was the first SMR, and I'll tell you why I know that, because when in '95 we went to Vienna to talk about our 100 megawatt machine, we were told you can't have a 100 megawatt nuclear power station. Doesn't exist, not possible. We've decided that large is 1200 plus, medium is 9 to 12, and small is 6 to 9, and nothing is below 600 megawatts. So yeah, my answer's simple. We don't know. I will tell you the numbers that we did the sums on, which says that if you get a technology shift, because I don't think that water-cooled SMRs are going to win that war. Can I guess there's a rabbit hole and a half, but let me go down it.
Yeah, let's go there.
Key thing about SMRs is you've got to build them in enough numbers to get mass production going. You've got to get a situation where suddenly you're no longer, even we're talking about 6 or 8 machines is a lot for a nuclear program. You're talking about 20 or 100 or 200 in an SMR program, like motor cars, like good engines. You look at the cost curves on those, and the cost curves are quite unbelievable. Look at them carefully. That's the first problem. The second problem is you've got to find that the safety argument moves away from high pressure components. And that's the problem that I have with water-cooled SMRs, because, and you can see it today, just digress a little bit, when they first bought the first water-cooled SMRs, they were singular unitary bodies, a single pressure vessel in which was a core at the bottom, SGs at the side, and a pressurizer at the top, and it was all very good and very clever, and if the pressure vessel survived, all was good. You've got a couple of problems with this thing. The first thing is to get that to you've got the to get enough inertia in that system, it's got to have a pretty big pressure vessel. When we were doing the advanced high temperature work in 2016 in ESCOM, we were coming up with a volume of the pressure vessel for a 80 megawatt machine that was smaller than the pressure vessel on a new scale machine. We were 90 bar gas, so we didn't care if it broke, because the pressure wasn't a safety issue. And the new scale's got 155 bar and is the ultimate safety case. And the problem is, once you say the pressure vessel mustn't fail, and the problem you've got is that when you get to minus 10 to the minus 7 to the minus 8 large release events as being the limit, and if you look at the safety case of these large single vessel SMRs, water-cooled SMRs, then you've got the problem that that vessel must not fail. And 10 to the minus 8 failure rate is something, I don't know how you get there. You're literally talking about 100 million year failure rate. That's really difficult. So I think that, personal view, I think SMRs have to go for one of two things, i.e. a much simplified but still separate unit. Look at the Rolls-Royce approach. I don't know where Holtec's going, but look at the Rolls-Royce approach, and also the Chinese approach with their water-cooled SMR, and they're keeping pressurizer and things separate because they find that they've got safety systems, but they're highly reliable ones. But in general, the problem with SMR is getting to a point where they can be bought as a standardized machine, like buying an Airbus or a Boeing.
Right.
And that's the question. No one's got close to that. And at the moment, my view of the SMR market is the first person who ends up with the order for 24 machines will start really chowing up the marketplace. And I think it's fascinating to look at the fact that no one's quite got there. Everyone's talking about building machines, but it's very easy to sell. The 40th machine is dead easy to sell. It's the first.
Well, I mean, this is when I ask, when I talk to the finance people, because I'm just the engineer. They all ask me this question: "Show me one, basically. Show me one that works."
Yeah.
What is the cost?
Of course, no one will say this. Yeah. Well, I'll give you the bad news, because no one will like this in the Western view. There is an SMR operating in the world today. It's a high temperature pebble bed reactor called the HTR PM. It's in Shandong in China. On the I can't pronounce the name. It's 210 megawatts, got 2 reactors, 2 megawatts feeding a steam turbine. They claim the cost of manufacture was $1 billion. I suspect they ignored interest costs and all other costs. Right. They quote the cost of, and so I've seen an estimate of a realistic estimate separately from that, which is an export machine, first export machine, will cost you about $1.6 billion or $8,000 a kilowatt, which is high. But if you believe learning curves, that machine, and that machine is real, it's running today, it's putting power into the grid in China today. The other one you can look at, of course, is the small Russian reactors, the water-cooled reactors, but they seem to me, the floating reactors, they seem mainly to be very remote areas, like the whole Canadian small modular reactor programs for northern Canada, where there is no prospect of a grid system. But the interesting one is the Chinese one, the HDRPM, is linked into the grid. It is feeding 200 megawatts into the grid. And it's the same technology as the PPMR.
So the
and
question
its safety
would be,
false.
I mean, PPMR is what South Africa developed. I mean, just when you were managing it, wouldn't it make sense for us to tell the Chinese, guys, let's come back and you guys won and let's learn from what you learned and build one? I mean, is that the feasible strategy?
Yeah. I'm not going to do an email. I'm a chair in the state corporation. I'm not going to do that. Well, there's been no extra. Certainly, these thoughts are rattling around. I wouldn't say where they're going, if not. But essentially, and Next has already asked. We've probably said this. Next has already asked our Minister of Resources and Energy, to actually allow us to extend our mandate to include nuclear power. Because currently our mandate doesn't include that as Next, so we're research and operating Safari and doing fuel cycles and things. So we're asking that question, and we've openly said that we would look at the prospect of trying to get an SMR built on our site as the first of class of an established design.
There's another question that was asked by Matthew Cole, and he basically asking, would they then, I mean, is there a possibility of the private sector coming into SMRs? Like, I suppose, on this basis?
I think the answer to that question is there's always a prospect of the private sector, and I'm very strong with the view which says you should never get the private sector out. But the problem that I've seen with private sector investment in major projects, certainly ones that are seen as high-risk projects, is the lack of faith in governments, which is almost universal. It's not just South Africa, but we're an extreme case. What you've got a situation, people say, well, okay, I'll invest some money, but there's a couple of criteria. The first criteria is I must hope to get better return than simply loan finance. Otherwise, I'll lend you the money. I secondly demand some level of political guarantee about it. So even though I'm taking some of the risk technically, I will demand a political risk that you will cover me if you change your policy. And lastly, I will
that's
demand
state subsidy already.
Right, and I will lastly demand damn near state's full control of the project. In other words, yes, I may only take 30% of it, but I'll demand essentially the CEO is from my company, and I have veto rights on the board. So I've never found a model where it says that loans are, to me, it's like the IPPs. You go out and you say, I'll give you a fixed price, I'll guarantee your payment, I'll guarantee your thing. And the answer is, well, why don't you just lend the money to Eskom, and then they return the investment, then you lend it at the state cost of debt, which is the lowest cost of debt in the country. Whereas the IPPs are getting 15%, because that's, and it seems to make sense, but it doesn't really. It's a subsidy. It's all, as you said earlier, all power systems, because you're linked to the country, because your product is sold at a market price that the government has some massive influence over, the state has to step in and be essentially a combination of a guarantor and a policy promise. If you're doing that, why doesn't the state do it? You can look at the US private sector utilities before they deregulated half the country, only half the country. They were essentially state concessions. Their return on investment was a function of their own. So I think we've got this view that the private sector should be getting involved in making things. Go at the old Eskom. A lot of private sector guys made a fortune from Eskom in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, not from running power stations, but from building services and providing services to Eskom.
Well, it's sort of I think this crux of this debate, how do you finance, who controls what? And I think at the end of the day, you run back to the state having some influence. You cannot escape that.
In which case, put the state body in place. And there's no history of state bodies state bodies can do it very effectively. Eskom was the best utility in the world at one point.
Let me ask you this.
Who are disastrous.
Well, let me ask you
Yeah.
then on that to explain to us, because you explained this to me in an SMS, and I found it very interesting, which was, can you explain how Eskom was making profit or playing for its plans during the 1990s, during the apartheid years, and what went wrong in the process?
Okay, well, what went wrong in the process was Eskom was, up until the 1990s, had the de facto obligation to supply and keep the country supplied with power. And as such, built power stations in advance. It overbuilt in the 1980s, as did most of the world because of a downturn in the economy. You were building power stations against a presumed 5%, in some case 10% increase in demand every year, and you were therefore ordering stations 14 years. It used to be 14 years from Eskom first committed to a coal station. I contract the collier, the coal mine, all the way to the sixth machine being online. And that was what happened. So when the whole thing went slow, then it took a couple of years to realize that the slowdown was real. And by then you were so far in and we had all excess capacity. So Eskom sort of wound down in the 1990s. And also its profit, its income was based upon its expenses. So therefore, as the debt was being paid off very quickly, partly because inflation makes debt go away. If you inflate everything up, your money goes. Eskom ended up by 2000 essentially debt-free. So the entire South African tariff was based upon Eskom saying, we're being told not to build anything. We're paying for operating and maintenance costs of the utility. We're going to build nothing extra. And that meant essentially, and I can go much more nuances here, but essentially Eskom was charging 1/3 the price it should have charged, because 2/3 your cost in the generating business is the cost of your capital. The government then told Eskom, so Eskom then demobilized its construction organization. So when I joined Eskom in '84, we had about 65,000 people in the organization. And at least more than half of those were involved in construction of power stations. That was the business we were in. Running them was simple. That was easy, but and because we were told there was no more, as much plant in construction in construction on order as we had in service. That's an interesting number. We had 34,000 megawatts of plant installed and 34,000 megawatts in construction at the same time. So when anyone tells me Medupi and Kusile were the biggest project I've ever seen, no, nowhere close. And then Eskom was told, well, you're not going to do that. Policy's changed. We're now going to the free market system, because that we know is the answer to all problems in the world, is the free market. The state mustn't get involved in planning. So Eskom then demobilized essentially all its engineering and its construction and its project management staff. And went down to below 30,000. By 2000, we were below 30,000 employees. And with the utility of the year for the world, what all wonderful stuff. But there was absolutely nothing being done for new build, because we've been told not to do new build, and that was not our mandate. And I remember two things. There was a request in 2000 to the board that Eskom should spend 6 million rand doing a bill of materials for a 6-pack coal station. In other words, to get a pretty good idea of what it would cost to build another Eskom 6-pack. And they were told, no, you're not spending the money, not allowed to. It's against the rules. And so Eskom at that point we got down to the point where we had, in the mid-90s, Eskom employed one civil engineer. One. Oh. At one point, an entire level of megawatt plant was taken to civil engineering departments. Because if you're not building anything, you don't have any civil engineers. It's really a maintenance. Is the building falling down is the question, not are you going to build a new one?
Right.
And then with this very low tariff, Eskom was told to go into the game of building Medupi and Kusile. Well, what happens was funny on that. Alec Irwin became Minister of Public Enterprises in 2004, and he read the 98 energy policy of 6 years earlier, which in the document said two general themes. One theme said we will get the free market to build power stations, and they will get their own contracts to provide. We'll use the grid as a trading organization, but essentially let's be a pass-through. It's like a truck company. Eskom will be the road system, but the guy who built, he'll pay a fee for using the road, but you'll have a supplier and a customer, and they will have a contract.
It's sort of like the EU electricity trading market. They've got some of these.
Which is
rules
really working well. I think the European Union price of power shows you it's working really well, because the highest single cost drives the entire tariff. Another discussion there for you, but is that and Eskom was then told overnight. So he came in. He said, "Okay, you say the lights are going to go out in 2007 if we aren't building more plants." That's what the document says. And Eskom said, "Well, that's what it says." It says, "Is the growth online to achieve that?" And Eskom said, "Dead online. The growth is exactly as predicted." Okay, what are you building to meet the gap? We're building nothing, sir. We've been told to build nothing. We've been told to shut up, draw our head in, not build anything. So who's building? Well, the white paper says the free market's going to build. What's the free market building? Absolutely nothing.
So okay. Why didn't the free market build? Was there no? Why couldn't the private sector just come in and put electricity on the grid? What was the blockage to that?
Can I come back to that? Because eventually, with that discussion now going on, is quite funny now. So, short answer, long question is: Eskom was then told to go from we have no preparation of any kind to build anything, to we're on site with bulldozers on the two biggest projects possibly in the world in 36 months, and that is a guarantee of failure. Right? Pre-planning is normally an important thing. Hence, you've got problems like the civil engineering estimate of concrete in Medupi and Kusile was 1/3 of the actual value. Hence, the price is higher than 40. Let's go back. So you asked the other question. Sorry, you're going to ask me to answer that question. You asked a question about why isn't the free market building? Okay, here's my answer to that question. As of today, everyone is running around being very proud of the fact that everyone is starting to claim that there is, 20,000 megawatts, 60,000 megawatts of free market power being projects underway. You've heard that statement.
I heard 60 gigawatts the other day.
Okay, I'll buy 60 gigawatts. Enormous amount. The problems are over. Now forget about. Okay, so that's fine. We can do that. So just for the sake of the discussion, so I've gone along and there's a whole reason why it's just jammed up the grid system, because everyone's booked their place in the grid system, which means the grid system is now full of projects, but they're all at the pre-feasibility stage. Right? So let me just take you that. So I'm now putting my renewable energy system in place, and I'm going to say it to you, Mr. Kruger, at a really good cost to meet your mining requirements of your deep level mine. Happy? I'm putting PV in. So my first question to you is, okay, I've got this contract. It's at 60 cents a unit. Assume I've got a contract with Eskom to wheel through the Eskom system. We'll assume that's not a big deal. They give me a charge. I complain about it, and you're going to take it. Happy, Mr. Kruger? Right. Small detail. Here's my contract. And you'll read the contract and say, this is a 20-year contract at a fixed inflation-linked price, take or pay. And it says somewhere you must provide irrevocable guarantees that you will pay this money for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
All right? And you will turn to us and say, I'm not quite sure I want to pay a 20-year contract to fix price. What happens if Eskom gets cheaper? That's not my problem. You've got to sign this contract. And so you might even sign it, but then you can, okay, what is guarantees you ask for? Because I'm running a mine, or I'm running a manufacturing plant or a smelter. And you ask me if I guarantee I'll be in business for 20 years.
Well, yeah.
Go to your bank and get a guarantee. Go and get a guarantee from your bank. I don't think your balance sheet is good enough. So you get a bank guarantee, which the bank, which you all trust, That's okay so far. Then we come to the second problem. That I says, well, I've got this problem. I'm in South Africa now. The sun's going down. The light's going down. We're in winter here. Small detail. What happens when your sun is not shining and you can't provide power? Well, that's your problem. So you're going to go to Eskom and tell Eskom, I want a contract to provide power when the sun goes down. You and the other 60,000 megawatts worth of suppliers, right? And Eskom says, excuse me, our costs are largely fixed. So we'll give you a capacity charge, which is about 2/3 of your current energy bill. Right?
That's a bit of a problem.
Okay, is it? Well, I don't care. If not, you'll get nothing from us because you're not on our standard tariff anymore. You're now you're cherry picking our tariff.
Yeah.
And I'm building plant, let's call it gas turbine plant, to meet you at evening peak and overnight.
Yeah.
We said, man. How are we doing so far? So my present guess is like the hundreds of gigawatts, not quite that, but let's say 100 gigawatts of nuclear that the Americans had projected in 2005-6 as being the nuclear renaissance in America, which was all except for 4 units abandoned. We're in the same game. I don't believe I believe you may find a few stations going, but I believe most of them are going to find themselves in it. They're going to find that they can't square the circle.
Yeah, they can't.
It's got to the point
financing does not add up. Yeah,
they've got up because you've got the guarantees don't work out.
Yeah. So how are the Europeans and the Americans getting away with it? What are they doing that we?
Are they getting away with it? What are they doing?
Well, I'm not sure because, like an example, France. Okay, France is nuclear.
Well, the price of power is a little bit higher than ours to begin with. The price of power, and I would argue that in most countries in Europe, there's still the amount that's in the renewable space, in the IPP renewable space, as free market IPP, right?
Yeah.
The grid has got fixed prices and it's buying power at rates that don't relate to commercial value. So in the UK, for example, you feed the grid.
Yeah.
You don't. I'm not aware. I don't see people in Germany and France and the European Union having a wind farm feeding a customer. The customer is the grid.
Yeah, they pay to the grid, and you've got these trading companies that buy from one guy and sell
and
to
the
another
grid price is manipulated.
Well, the thing that never makes sense to me is how does it make sense for me in France to buy from?
Anyone turns to me and says, "Well, I've got to go, and I've got to go because I've got to." But and sorry, we got much fun. Let's do this again. But I'd argue that what's happening is that those prices, people are saying, "Oh, I will sell you 100% renewable energy," right? But the answer is it isn't, because at night they take credit for that. In the UK, 50% of more than 50% of distribution companies have gone bankrupt in the last couple of years.
Well, it's not much different.
Not the customers. Right. And EDF is still there. And I really must go. Unless you got some last question, I've got.
No, I think that this was brilliant. We should do this in the future as well. So yeah, I'd like to thank you very much for that. And I think we're going to do this in the future as well. Thank you very much, Dave. I appreciate it.
Okay, cheers. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Cheers.
Thanks all.